Well, welcome to another Sunday afternoon class from the BYU Library Family History Center. We're going to be talking today about finding your ancestors' occupations and religions. And just a note before we get started, one of the problems that we have with, and I'm probably going to say this more than once in my presentation, is that a lot of genealogists, many beginning genealogists, can find the easy records, and sometimes they're not as all helpful as you need, and you're missing vital information to move to the next generation, for example. And a lot of times, these two types of records, the occupational records and the religious records, are records that can answer that question. So we'll get right into it here. This is another issue, and I'm starting with this because it's very helpful to know about this particular issue. This is the program is called Find My Past, and it's a British program. I use it because I can do one simple thing. I can put in a name and a surname, and it will tell me how many results there are in their entire catalog of records. And so it gives me a rough estimate of the popularity, let's say, or the number of people with that particular first name, given name or surname in English. So here we are, and I have put in for the world records, and Find My Past has many records, millions and millions of records around the world, but primarily from what we would call the British Empire countries: England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., India, any place. Those are the records that they have primarily. They have other records, and they have some surprising sets of records, like a collection of the early Catholic diocese records from the United States, which Family Search has been unable to get. So here we put in a very common name, and Smith comes up in almost any application that looks at name frequency, and it is the top of the list in English in any country. And then Schmidt in German is probably number one, and the same name in other countries is probably the same one, even at different languages. But John is another one. If it's not the most popular name right now, it's the most common name. And it may run close to Joseph as the most popular name around the world in the various languages. But here we have 3,500,000 plus million results of records that have this name, John Smith. And so what this is illustrating is that, and if you go through this process with just Google search or even whatever, you'll find that there are almost very few names that are unique. And I'm going to give you an exception in Utah Valley in Utah in the United States. There are a lot of unique names here, and it's interesting. There's YouTube videos about all the different Utah Valley names or Utah names that have been made up names. So it's kind of I don't know if it's a tradition, but it's a feature of living in Utah that you're going to have people with names that are spelled completely differently than you would expect. So that's why is that important? Well, the reason it's important is that when you're searching for people, and you go to an index and you search for somebody's name, even if you put in a birth date and a country or a place or whatever, you're likely to get a whole long list of people with that name. And in some cases, you will get people with the same name, and their spouse will have the same name as the people you're looking for. And the children will have or all of the same names. And in one instance, when I was doing some English research, I kept having this family that every time I looked, I got the two families. And it was the birth dates were very close. The names were exact, the children kind of a little bit different, but not enough to tell which family is which. And finally, I just noticed, and I should have started that well into the beginning of the process, that they had different. The two men who had the exact same names had different occupations. And then when I looked at the census records, finally got to the census records in England, where they both showed up on the same census record. They lived next door to each other. So the name, the place, and the dates were no help. And it was only through their occupations that I was able to see that these were two different families and hadn't just been duplicated in the census record. So I would guess most all of a lot of the confusion that goes into a program like the Family Search Family Tree is different because we have names that are the same names. And we have what's called the same name syndrome or same name problem that exists in the background of almost everything we do in genealogy. And even though I am so painfully aware of the problem, I will sometimes get trapped into it by not giving very much, not giving enough focus on the location and other information that goes along with everybody. So you can see here from this screenshot from Family Search that we have 3 generations where the person's name's exactly the same. Previously, when this happened in Family Search, let's say historically, people would number them with Roman numerals like Gerard Morgan 1, Gerard Morgan 2, and Gerard Morgan 3. Well, we won't want that on there because we don't want that confuses the computer. That's not a name. It's not an established suffix or a prefix or whatever. And so in most cases, it's just have to kind of grin and bear it that they each have the same name and that they're different. In this case, it wasn't too hard because there's a lot of difference between the two in the dates and when they were established. And there's lots of records about these 3 individuals that shows that there really were these 3 different individuals. So when you're confronted with a lot of duplicate names, you have to start using something else to distinguish them. And looking at my own given name, James Tanner from Family Search, here's a list of 163,259 records that have my name, James Tanner, on it. I remember becoming aware of that when I was a teenager, and my family visited Arlington National Cemetery. And driving into the cemetery, there was a rather prominent grave marker that had in big letters James Tanner on it. I figured that I wasn't dead, so I wasn't there, and that must have been somebody else with the same name. And then I began to realize how many other people there must be with a common English name of Tanner and a common English given name of James. And it's true. There's lots of people out there. So one of the suggestions is that when you get in this situation, that you start focusing on the person's occupation and religion. And that's an interesting question because when I'm helping people a lot of times, I will come to the point where they're trying to figure out which of their ancestors is in the record and which one it isn't. And I say, well, what religion were they? And they won't know. And I'll say, well, what occupation were they? The issue here is how do you go about finding out what these things were? What were the records and what were the methodology for finding religion and occupation? And all I can say is that knowing an occupation and a religious preference will assist in finding more records. So if you do find an occupation, there's a world of records that open up to occupations. And if you are doing religious records are immensely valuable anytime you have to go back before the particular country you're working for or working with was making records to record births, marriages, and deaths. And in Latin America, for example, it's uniform because the only records that would go beyond that point in any consistency are the parish records from the Catholic Church. So knowing if somebody was in the Catholic Church, which would be an assumption in Latin America, and then using the Catholic Church records allows you to go beyond what's called the civil registration records, which began to be used around 1850. Earliest would be 1830s, and latest would be in like 1870s, depending on the country and the area of the country. So, and those civil registration records would give births, marriages, and deaths. The Christian Catholic Church records would be baptisms, marriages, and burials. So a birth record before there are civil registration records in most Catholic countries around the world are going to be very, very limited. But that doesn't overcome the problem completely, because if you get into a country like any one of the Latin countries, like Argentina or Colombia or Ecuador, or any of these countries down in Latin and South America, then since everybody, essentially very high percentages were members of the Catholic religion, it's still going to have the problem. And I have to concede that even if you have the occupation and the religion, it's only helpful in some countries at some times. It is not something that is a universal way of identifying people. And this is, for instance, some records from the Mexican government census in 2020. And at that point in time, they're saying that 78% of the population identifies as Roman Catholic. So finding that your ancestors' religion isn't going to help you a lot with getting the same name problem resolved. And if you're talking about occupations, in 1850, 64% of the US population workforce, about 4.9 million people, were farmers. So they're all going to just be listed as farmers. That doesn't mean that there aren't further records that can help. That's just in both cases. If you know the person was Roman Catholic, then that opens up the possibility that you could find Roman Catholic records about that individual. If you know the person was a farmer, this opens up a lot of different records, the land and property records, it lists probate records, it lists farm co-op records, almost anything there's just lots of different categories of records that will take you further along and give you more specificity about who you're trying to find. And you can see that there was a dramatic change from 1840, when 69% of the working force were farmers, and that dropped to 64%. By the way, the percentages today run about 10% of the U.S. population, more or less, are in the farming industry directly. And this is another interesting thing, because here's the Catholic Church's assessment of its parishes and its membership. And they say that 99 million of the people in Mexico are Catholic, and that's 91.89%. So if you ask the church has 91% of the people on their records, whereas the people who provide their claimed religion, it's somewhat less than that. But you can pretty much count on using the Catholic Church records in Latin America, even if the people didn't turn out to be Catholics. At some point in time, they may have been, by force of law in one of those countries, to become Catholic, or at least get baptized into the church. One thing that's important also to understand is that some of these general categories of religious and preference and occupation are worldwide issues. So when we say there were so many farmers in the United States, then we're going to have that same kind of calculation in almost any other state I mean, federal government, any other government of around the world. And those are common kinds of things. And so you're going to find some similar types of records in many different countries that you begin to look at for records. So Catholics all around the whole world keep records in their parishes, which are the smaller membership oriented in a geographic area, and the dioceses, which are larger geographic areas with several up to a dozen or more parishes, and sometimes even more than that. And it's interesting because these records, like the Catholic Church records, go back in the United States, the part of the North America that we now claim as the United States, and that's goes back into 1610. Now it's earlier than the Pilgrims, by the way, who showed up in 1620. So if your people came from the Southwest, you may very well have a connection if they were indigenous at the time, may have a connection here to the Catholic Church in Arizona or New Mexico or Texas or Southern California or any of the other countries where there were predominantly Mexican before the Mexican War with the United States. And interesting thing is that if you just are interested, if you want to pursue this a little bit further, there's a very simple way to do this. What you do is you have to, first of all, you have to identify the actual place where the ancestor lived. And that can be any place on the face of the earth. But what you want it to be, the reason you want it to be is because you want it to show local records. So it's not helpful to say that your ancestor came from France, for example. It would be helpful if you knew which parish they were baptized in. So the location is tremendously important in the first instance with doing any genealogical research, but it only helps if you actually know that location. And so part of the initial process of doing research for an ancestor is to verify the identity of the actual places where events occurred in their lives. So what you can do here with Google Maps is I'm showing a place called San Francisco de los Romo, and all you have to do is type churches after you've found the place name. So if I did a search for San Francisco de los Romo and then put churches in, then this is what I would get. I would get a listing of all of the churches in that particular town. So first of all, it's pretty obvious up there at the top one is a Parroquia de Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe. Well, the parroquia is the parish, so that's where the records are going to be kept. Except you see here, there's a Templo de San Francisco de Asís, and you see San Francisco de los Romo, or another church. It's possible that that's the diocese or the cathedral. So you just need to then you need to do a little more research. And fortunately, with Google Maps, if you click on those markers, you'll get information about that particular church, and usually enough information to either contact the church by mail or by computer or telephone. So this is what it would look like, and it tells you what the church is, and that says when it's open and those kinds of information. There's also more information about this. Sometimes, as you're going back in time, you can tell a person's religious preference by their given names. This one's a fairly obvious one. Joseph de Vries, one of my direct line great-grandfathers, was back in early 1700s. Well, we step back into the 1600s, and his father's name was Marcus Mordecai Jacob de Vries. Now, this is an indication that this person was Jewish and followed the naming pattern of the the Jews that existed back in the 1600s. And the 1600s makes it helpful because Marcus Mordecai Jacob de Vries is his given name, his father's given name, and his grandfather's given name. And then if you have more, then these names can get pretty long with many, many names. And then each one of those names is going to be the name of one of the direct line ancestors. So it's like sort of like the patronymic system, but they didn't change the form of the names or make it a surname. They still used the surname of place that they were originally from when they started making the names. And it's interesting to note, this is a side note on this, is that when I started my DNA test results years ago, the test results came back fairly immediately with showing that I had a significant percentage of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestors, which is correct. And it's been documented now by me and others fairly extensively back into the 1600s in the Netherlands. And all that has disappeared from both my heritage and from ancestry. My DNA results today do not show that I have ancestors from Western Europe, but they don't show anything having to do with Jewish ancestry, and I'm not sure how that happened or why. So now we can see some other kinds of records that may help crack that problem of determining the basic religion. Now, we may know just from the fact that knowing about state religions that existed across the world and still exist across the world, that where countries have a supported state religion and they may either suffer other religions or not. In other words, they may just not allow people to function in their religious beliefs when they're not the state religion, or they would allow people to have other than the state religion, but you're still going to have predominantly the people who were state religion. And that shows some interesting. This is something that comes up fairly common. There's a long story about how the Scots got into Northern Ireland and settled. They were actually brought there as farm laborers after the British drove the Irish out of the area of Northern Ireland. So they drove the Irish off into the west up the hills and put in their own people that they recruited from England and Scotland. So we have a substantial number of what we call Scots-Irish people who came from Scotland. Now, the British did that again in Scotland and drove out the people and put in who were subsistence farmers and basically turned them into manor houses and raised sheep. So they needed the sheep and the wool more than they needed the food from the farmers. And the farmers, of course, didn't have an option. But those are kind of the things that if you start to understand this, you'll understand that the possibility of William Linton, who was born in County Tyrone, which is in Northern Ireland, was probable that he was Presbyterian. Well, but I had to know that. In other words, would I look for what I do? Well, I was looking, of course, for birth, marriage, and death records, and I found William Linton. He died at age 52 on 4 December 1851. And then I found his grave marker, and that was in the Westminster Cemetery in Ballysinwood in Pennsylvania. And he was buried according to the cemetery, he was born in 1907. Well, I was wondering what happened to him between 1851 when he died and 1907 when he was interred in the Westminster Cemetery. I don't imagine that they kept him in the front room or any place, but further research, because I made an assumption here. I made an assumption that because they came from Northern Ireland, that they were probably Presbyterians, because the majority of the people in Scotland were Presbyterians. Well, it was helpful because what I found eventually in the Philadelphia City Archives was a WPA, the Works Progress Administration, a microfilm roll of transcribing early grave markers. And I found that he was actually buried very shortly after. Actually, the day he died, he was buried in the Presbyterian Church burial ground. And then they dug him up and reburied him in the Westminster Cemetery. But now I've got an interesting thing because I have the Presbyterian Church burial ground, and I found out that that was the fourth Presbyterian church in Philadelphia. And when I did the research for the fourth Presbyterian church in Philadelphia, I found that his records were in that church, and we found additional records about the family. So here he was buried in the fourth Presbyterian church burial ground, gave me a window into additional records. Not that there was an issue with same name, same person. In this case, there was just an issue of how these people got to America, where they lived when they got to America, and where they were living in Ireland, so I could find records of the rest of their family. Well, then this problem continues even to today. So this is just one part of what happened with that. Now, another thing that we may have are some obituaries, and this brings up the fact that much of the employment issue and the religious issue can often be solved by looking through newspapers. And today, I would venture to say that almost the least of the people, let's say the people who are listening to this broadcast initially, my guess is that very few, if any of you, take a paper newspaper every day now. You get a paper newspaper, anybody? We can see if anybody wants to respond. But the answer to that's probably that there are almost none. Almost none. Oh, here's one that says they do. Okay. So there's still very few people now today who take, and that's affected, of course, the whole newspaper business and on and on and on. That goes on and on. It has to do with technology. But one of the things that's helpful is that there's all these obituaries sitting out there in these newspapers. And one of the things that you're going to find out in an obituary very frequently is that this person had been a wholesale hardware business and formerly worked for Zion's Co-op Missionary and Mercantile Institute, and later employed by the U.S. Steel Products Company. Okay, so here's a couple of places you could start to look for information about this person using information from the obituary telling where he was formerly occupied. Now, your question is going to be, well, I didn't know there were records to look for. And if he was in the hardware business, how would you determine where he was working? Well, that's kind of the work we do as genealogists. We're kind of detective type people. We spend some time thinking about how we might find the records, and then we think about where the records might be. And one of the easiest ways to start, for example, that comes to mind is a city directory. And I happen to know that he lived in Salt Lake City, and I know that there were city directories back until the early days of Salt Lake City. And so he's going to show up in a number of years of city directories, and they will show probably which actual business he was working at, and at least possible in that case. And also some research into these particular organizations you may be able to find records. Now, where would those records be kept? They're not genealogical records per se. They're not the kind of things that you're going to find being digitized by one of the major websites. That's just right now is not happening. But as time goes on and they get more and more records, they may very well start getting into these kinds of records. And where are these records? Well, these records are usually end up in either archives that specifically house these kinds of work records, or in university special collections libraries. So there's places out there to look for the history records, and I'm pretty sure right now, as I look at it, I could probably find ZCMI records, including the substantial records of the employees, somewhere here in Utah. And as far as religion, you're going to have the same kinds of things appear in the obituaries. It might be buried in the church burial plot. The person may have been active in their religion, and therefore that's noted in their obituary. And in this case, it tells us the ward that he was active in and the Young Men's Mutual Improvement Association. So there are then records that are available of LDS Church, the Church Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints records that would show more information about this individual. And if there were any questions about who he married, when he married, what time, any kind of detailed type information that you're still not finding on this person, there was going to be additional records that could be searched. And if, for example, if you, for any reason, wanted to write a biography of this person or show a descendancy from this person and do the work that that would entail and write some history of the family, then you would obviously be interested in looking at all of these different kinds of records that are here. Some of these things are just in the category of obvious. And it's obvious that some religions have their own cemeteries. I spent some of my early years in a small town in eastern Arizona, and there were two cemeteries. There was the city cemetery that was primarily people who were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And there was a second cemetery for those who lived in the town who were Catholics. And so there were two separate cemeteries. So if someone was buried in the Catholic cemetery, then you had a pretty good chance that you would find records about that person in the parish, in the St. John's. Name of the town was St. John's, Arizona, in the St. John's parish, and that may also have shown up in the diocese, wherever the diocese was in that part of Arizona at the time. And you might be able to find some articles that help you along the way, like this one, for example, is just a lookup kind of thing where I just kind of looked up what makes a Catholic cemetery Catholic, and somebody had an article exactly on point. And so it might explain a little bit more about why people are born there. I've got the URL if somebody wants to look at that. Now, when I do this, you might be aware that we said at the beginning of this presentation that all of these presentations are recorded and they go into the BYU Library Family History Center website. They also are posted on the BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel. And so you've got two places to look. And if you need to go back to this, you simply can fast forward through the video and then stop, pause, and copy down the URL. So in effect, the videos themselves become the handouts for these presentations, these classes. Now, another possibility is what happens if you investigate the cemetery. And some of my ancestors came from a town in central Utah called Nephi. Well, not quite to central Utah, but not considered to be northern Utah. And so we decided to go actually over a couple of times, but one specific time, we spent some time finding the headstones of all of the people who were in the cemetery. And there were some people there in the cemetery at the time. And after we'd found it, they said, well, all of them are listed in the cemetery record book. It's right over there in that little shed. And so they had access to that. They let us look at that. And so I started taking pictures of it. But then they said, well, you may not have all the information. You should go to the sexton's office. We went, okay, there's a sexton's office. And so we went downtown to downtown Nephi, went into the city building, and the sexton had a little office in there. And we had a nice discussion with him. And then he said, "Oh, by the way, did you know there was a book that was kept, a record that was kept and developed of all the people who settled in Nephi, Utah, up to a specific period of time? I don't remember, but it was like 50 or 60 years or 100 years. And it said everything, all the baptisms, all the marriages, all the deaths, everything that they found about every single person in that town." I said, no. I said, "Who has the book?" And they said, "Oh, well, there's a copy in the library in Salt Lake, the Family Search Library, and there's a copy right there on the shelf." My next question was, "Can we take pictures of the pages?" And then the answer was yes. That kind of got obviated later because actually this book was in the library in Salt Lake and was digitized and is now available. But this is the kind of record that came along with the city cemetery. And so investigating the cemetery gave us access to a lot of records, a lot of names and records that would probably be fairly accurate. I would put them into the fairly accurate category. They were made about or near the time of the events, but they would be invaluable in giving you more information about who lived in the town and when. So this is the kind of benefit that you get when you break out of the ropes holding you into the very basic core records of birth, marriage, and death and census records and start looking at alternative records in different ways. And it also illustrates the importance of sometimes going and doing actual online research. I mean, in place research, like going to the towns where they were born and looking at the graves or looking at finding out where the records. And there were 2 copies of this book made. So I say one of a kind because there was one of a kind in Nephi. Another kind of record out there are the military records. And it may surprise you to find out that military records sometimes tell the occupation of the person. So when this person, whoever he was, got registered for World War II, and it says that his employer's name was C.R. Ogden, and deployment was in a place called Kerman, California. And now that gives you an opening. That gives you another place to go look for this person's records. It also may identify some original records about the family that you may or may not be, may be able to find and may not be able to find. But bearing in mind that the records may have moved from this time period in 1940 to some other venue, and then I would start looking at university special collections libraries around where this place was located, and the state archives and any other kind of archives, and local museums and genealogical societies and all of the other kinds of people who are going to be very much interested in this particular thing. So now we're going to kind of move through some records here. And rather than highlight all this, mentioning that census records, this 1841 English census, and the occupations of my ancestors here, Joseph DeFries and his family, are mentioned. And if you can't read it really quickly, it's merchant, medical student, and undertaker. The last one is pretty interesting. He doesn't appear to be related, but we have to go look and see how he was related, if he was. And a little bit of research on Joseph DeFries found this record. And what this record was that he was admitted to the freedom of the city of London. That was quite an accomplishment because it's the city of London is a district of London about 1 mile square. It's the original city in Roman and medieval times. and it was the right to work in that 1 mile square. And he had a business of funeral feather merchants. Now, what happened? Why was there the feathers? They were feathers on the horses drawing the hearses. Let's say that fast. And the horse with the hearse. And on the front of the horse, where the mane started, they would attach a feather along like a bundle of different kinds of feathers. And the horses didn't like them, and they would just bang their heads against the wall and knock them off and ruin them. And so there was a constant flow of customers for those particular feathers, and that's how he made a religion. And I'm just going to kind of highlight some more areas. Railroad workers, you cannot believe how many railroad records there are. Railroads seem to love to keep records, and people love to collect those records and put them into libraries and archives across the country. And now you can't really count on the fact that because the railroad's long of where it might have ended up, and you might have to do some pretty extensive search in different libraries and archives. But we have AI now. You might be able to find some more records that way. Pullman employee records. I had an opportunity to do some pretty extensive research into Pullman company records, and there are repositories for Pullman records all over the country, and some very large library collections of these records of all the people who were Pullman employees. Now, I said earlier there were lots of farmers, and one of the things that happened very, 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 very early in the world of farming was farming co-ops. That meant they got together to negotiate prices for their grains or their corn or whatever they were negotiating with. And the co-op records are another thing that's kept, and they're all very, very detailed and may give you extensive information about your family's farm and the people who lived on that farm. Union records. This is just one, and this one happens to be at Penn State University and in their special collections. And it's the United Steelworkers District 33 records. And if you know where your ancestor lived and it said that they were a steelworker in the US Census, then you could jump to these kinds of records in the library, and then a lot of other records which may give you additional information. People who do research, who actually do genealogical research, meaning they pursue topics that get them into original records at different locations, like the libraries and the archives and the special collections and things. Those are the people who understand how to get into these. Now, anybody could do that. They just need to take the effort to understand how you work with a library and archives. That's a whole different subject. This is a historical society, and they have a lot of Pennsylvania State Historical Society, and they have very active. And I can say for sure, because I have ancestors in Pennsylvania, that Pennsylvania records are extensive and well beyond what's readily available online. And if you're looking at other religions and it comes up that your people were Baptist instead of Catholics or whatever, then you might want to be aware that some of the Baptist churches did keep records, and some of them, the records are not complete in ways that we would be happy with as a genealogist. But there is a Southern Baptist Historical Library and Archive, and finding that is very easy. Just put the name in. And so look for church history libraries. Look for libraries that handle the records of the history of the church and may very well have information about the membership records in various church organizations. This is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Church History Library in Salt Lake City. It's about 2 big Utah blocks from the Family Search Library. and not nearly so used as the Family Search Library, but it has some invaluable records that are just, they have a large section of books and things to go through, and then you can make an appointment with the people and come in here and do research. And there's some people who have used the library to the point on a recent visit that we made to the library, where we dropped a few names and found out that they were so popular in the library that the employees there at the library recognized them immediately and told us where they sat in the library when they came. This same thing, here's the Catholic University libraries, special collections, and archives, manuscripts, rare books, and articles. And until you start digging into these, inevitably you'll be surprised at the depth of the information that's available and where it is. It's also a good idea to look for photos of your ancestors. Here's some of my direct line ancestors. This would be, looks like Henry Overson here, loading hay, and probably some of his children or perhaps brothers or whatever who are there working away. And so we know they were probably farmers. And then we look at a picture of Marinus Christensen, and it's obvious that he's a blacksmith. So there's a way into learning more information. If you run into the situation where you are getting some names for occupations that appear to be absolutely incomprehensible, even though you can finally decipher their handwriting, and you get to it and you say, that makes no sense at all, then it might be time for you to go look in some of these books. This is Ada Zach's. It's a dictionary for genealogists and historians. Now, this is a paper book, and I give you the link to the paper book, but and it's just for those of you who like to pick up paper, but all this information is digitized and online. So it's not going to be helpful, because here's the records, for example. This is a dictionary of old occupations from A to Z, and it's larger than most free online resources for old trades and occupations. There's going to be a lot of this information that's available. And here's another, the paper version of the online resource. And it's a Kindle edition. So the key here is to become educated of the types of records that might be available, and then begin to learn how these records could be found. Look, the reason why we have and Family Search has a vast network of over 6,000 family history centers across the world is that we want to be able to help people directly and able to come in and ask. And then when you get to the point where your local family history center, Family Search Center, does not seem to have the answers, you always have the resources of the BYU Library Family History Center through our virtual help desk. And you also have that same opportunity to connect with the Salt Lake Family Search Library. So there's ways to get information and ways to find people who are willing to help and serve, and kind of explain how you go about finding some of these extremely valuable records. Okay, well, thanks for watching.
Well, James, we have one question in the Q&A.
Where did I find the deeds? I found them in the Family Search Labs, and it's an AI search. And you go to the Family Search Lab, familysearch.org/labs. And then you can look, and there's the AI search engine they have will search a set of records, one of which is land and property and probate records. And it's just amazing.